This is This Alt-Right Life with Matt Forney.
Get ready, the world is changing.
And a very warm welcome to you, whether you're listening in Europe, America, or anywhere in the world. I'm Matt Forney, and this is This Alt-Right Life. I'm coming to you from my makeshift studio, somewhere in the seedy underbelly of Chicago, Illinois. Thank you for tuning into this second episode of the program for the week of May 16th, 2016. On this episode, I'll be talking to Jared Taylor. Jared Taylor is the founder and editor of American Renaissance, a monthly online magazine dedicated to examining race relations in America and advocating for whites. He is also the president of the New Century Foundation and the organizer behind the American Renaissance Conference. The American Renaissance Conference takes place every year. In fact, this year's conference will be taking place in a few days, actually, on Friday. May 20th, in Nashville, Tennessee. I will be there if, you'll be, for those of you who are going to be there as well, be sure to stop by and say hi. But, Jared and I, we discussed race relations in America, the impact of the Trump campaign on race relations on white Americans and American politics. We discussed the third edition of the new edition of The Color of Crime, a publication put out by American Renaissance on what crime statistics in this country actually look like, and we discussed that and many more topics, so stay tuned, coming right up. All right, Jared, welcome to This Alt-Right Life. Happy to have you on the program.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, now I can't imagine there are a whole lot of people in this listening to this who don't know who you are and what American Renaissance is, but it's as a journalist, I've learned that it's always good to let the subject define themselves in their own words. So for the people in the audience who don't know who you are, Mr. Taylor, can you just give a sort of brief introduction as to yourself, your work, American Renaissance, that sort of thing?
Certainly. I founded American Renaissance as a monthly print magazine in 1990. So it's hard to believe we've been going 26 years. A few years ago, we shifted all of our content to the internet. But the purpose of American Renaissance always was to stand up for white people. All other racial groups clearly have their publications, their pressure groups, their associations that push for their interests, legitimate or not. And it's always been my view that whites as a racial group have extremely important legitimate interests and that someone must stand up for them and try to preserve them. So that has been from the outset the purpose of American Renaissance and the cause to which I've devoted the last 25 years of my life.
Yep, and you're not exactly. I mean, this sounds like a kind of a trite question, but people like you and me are not exactly the stereotype most people have of alt-right people. I mean, I'll give an example. About 3 years ago, actually, I was contacted by ABC News to give an interview on the Manosphere alt-right, and as I'm talking to them, they're all like, "You're very articulate. Did you go to college?" And I guess they assumed I would be some sort of knuckle-dragging misanthrope who signs my name with an X. What sort of got you into doing this as a career? What sort of brought you to your political beliefs?
It was the gradual realization that whites are being dispossessed in the country that their ancestors founded, that it has become considered to be a form of evil for whites to take the most obvious steps necessary to ensure their continuation as a distinct people with a distinct culture. I just saw that America was going in a terrible direction and that all of those who were trying to stand up and stop it from going in that direction were demonized, penalized, ostracized. And I thought, I think it's absolutely necessary that at least a few of us band together to save what is really a priceless heritage that we have inherited from our European forebears and that we have every right to wish to pass on intact to our descendants. As you point out, whenever the left tries to depict someone who takes that view, it's their preference to depict them as ignoramuses, as unhinged, perhaps outright insane, certainly people who are loathsome and whom ordinary people would wish to avoid at all costs. And so, yes, they're often surprised to discover that we, in fact, have well-articulated, thoughtful positions, that we don't marry our first cousins, that we don't all work as gas station attendants when we're not lying around drunk. Yes, that's a great shock to them.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and even to this day, they sort of keep this. It's a way of demonization. It's a lot easier to dismiss us if they just assume that we're just marrying our first cousins and whatnot. I mean, another fine example is I attended the NPI conference in Washington D.C. in October. Me and my friend were coming in after having to go to the iPhone store for an unrelated incident, and we get cornered by this reporter from the Daily Beast, who is this sort of cute, youngish, 21 bottle blonde, and she's like asking kind of very basic questions like, "What do you do inside of these conferences? What attracted you to such an outsider movement?" And we're like, "What do we do? We sit around, we drink coffee, and we talk about preserving our culture. It's not like some kind of Bohemian Grove type thing. We're not sacrificing goats or whatever. We're just ordinary people who want to see our country sort of see our nations being invaded, taken over, and we want to we want what other people have. You've got the some of the trite memes in the alt-right have become a bit trite. It's like, Africa for Africans, Asia for Asians, white countries for everyone else. But, if everyone else has the right to preserve their culture and their patrimony, so do we. We didn't arrive at this out of a reflexive hatred of everyone, but, just basic self-preservation.
Of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center has pioneered this idea that somehow anyone who dissents from racial orthodoxy is a loathsome creature that really deserves to stay under a flat rock. Their goal is not to show that we are wrong. Their goal is, if possible, completely to shut us up, make sure that we have no access to the airwaves, to television, or to mainstream print media. And if it is not possible to shut us up entirely, their goal is to depict us as hate mongers. And the idea there, of course, is that anyone who is motivated by hate is blinded to reality, blinded to morality. And anyone who is blind to reality and to morality, and someone whom the SPLC designates as a hate monger, is someone that the rest of the country can simply ignore. That is their purpose. It would be much better for us if they actually tried to grapple with our ideas. But that, of course, is the last thing they wish to do. I think that at some level, they know that they would have a very, very difficult time grappling with the points that we make. The one that you made, for example, that for every other racial group and for every non-white country, it is taken for granted that they should preserve their heritage, that they should be proud of their origins, that as far as every non-white nation is concerned, that they should preserve their national majorities and their heritage and their national culture. It is only for whites, and exclusively for whites, that somehow morality demands that they let every group in the world into their countries, even if it means that they are diluted physically, even genetically, even if it means that ultimately whites will go extinct because they're pushed out by non-whites. This is a suicidal double standard. And I have never, ever heard anyone even attempt to explain why this double standard is legitimate. And therefore, to me, the whole purpose of being a racial dissident is to explain, as you just pointed out, all we want really is to be left alone. We want the right to establish our own societies, our own communities, and let our destiny develop free from the unwanted embrace of others. Of course, the great difficulty for whites is that we build the most desirable, successful societies in the world. And it's perfectly natural that people from failed societies, from south of our border, or from the Middle East, or from Africa, should want to come and push their way into our societies and benefit from the wonderful things that our ancestors have created. I don't blame them for trying to do that. What I blame, of course, is this ultimately suicidal double standard that suggests that we have a right to we have an obligation to let them do that. This, in the end, will destroy us.
Yes, I mean, looking at it from just a natural point of view, people tend to cluster into, like-minded communities oriented around racial and ethnic lines. I mean, I'll give another example. I live in Chicago. Chicago is, I forgot where this was stated, but Chicago is one of the most racially segregated cities in America. You have whites on the north side, you have blacks on the south side, you have Hispanics on the west side. And when he was mayor, Richard J. Daley worked to keep the races separate through the construction of, through various policies such as highway construction. I forget the name I think it's the Dan Ryan Expressway. It was specifically laid out in the middle of the city to isolate the infamous Cabrini Green housing project from wealthier areas to the north. And, leftists sort of look at this and this is horrible. This is discrimination. But, Daley got elected by overwhelming majorities year after year after year because both white and black Chicagoans, they didn't want to interact with each other. They wanted their own communities, and it's not really holding up very well now as the corruption in government and the skyrocketing murder rate has shown. And also the Black Lives Matter activism. But we see this pattern everywhere. Whites like being among their own. Blacks like being among their own. Latinos like being among their own. There's nothing wrong with that. But we've seen, like, for example, with Obama, the Obama administration is now funding Section 8 housing to sort of into wealthy areas such as Baltimore County and Westchester County, New York, to dilute white communities. If your community is too white, if your community is not diverse enough, we're going to bring the diversity to you whether you want to or not. And that's something that it's deleterious to whites, obviously, but also deleterious to everyone else. People should be left to organize into their own communities, and forced diversity is a detriment to everyone who's it's forced on.
Well, I have to disagree with the idea that diversity is always detrimental to certain people. If you are living in the black ghetto and you can't step out your house without having to duck gunfire, if you can't go around the corner without finding crack whores, you can't without finding drug dealers, then probably you're going to be better off if Section 8 housing puts you in the midst of well-behaved white people. There can be benefits to certain people from being taken outside of their communities. Obviously, though, for the whites, onto whom this kind of diversity has been parachuted against their wills, it is a terrible plague. Those people probably will then bring some of their habits with them, and before long, if there is a sufficient number of them, then once again you'll have drug dealers and crack whores around the corner. You'll just have them surrounded by horrified white people. Yeah. But to give Barack Obama and the people who work for him at least the benefit of the doubt, I don't honestly think that their purpose is to bring and to drag down white people. I think their purpose is one in which they think that if these people from the black ghettos can live in middle-class neighborhoods, that they will somehow absorb the good habits, the idea of being married and getting a job. They will absorb the good habits of the people in whose neighborhoods they live, and that they will also benefit from the better schools, perhaps from the cleaner environment, that this will be good for them without being bad for the whites. I don't think that there are very many people out there who are rubbing their hands and saying to themselves, okay, how are we going to destroy white people? Let's turn loose the most degenerate ghetto black people in their neighborhoods and watch them squirm. I really don't think that Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi or Barack Obama actually think in those terms. Of course, every one of these experiments of trying to uplift blacks by putting them in white neighborhoods or in white schools has failed. You can spend millions and millions of dollars busing black children into white schools, having them sit next to whites in class, having them take instruction from the very same teachers, and you do not improve their academic performance. This has been shown over and over and over again. In terms of having black people live among whites, there are going to be some blacks who will benefit from being protected from the environment that blacks in large numbers very frequently produce. But this comes at a terrible cost to the whites on whom they are inflicted.
Yeah, I mean, I'd clarify. I'd say I agree with you on that point. I misspoke there, but that's a very good point. And I guess the left thinks that magical osmosis, that if you stick low-performing people among high-performing people, they'll just magically. I mean, Vox Day has a term for this called magic dirt theory, though he applies it more to the idea of immigrants, for example. And it's the same kind of logic. We see the left and we see certain figures on the right say that if we bring in people from the third world who have had no experience of Western white culture, Western values, they'll just magically assimilate at some point. And what we've seen is that when you bring in large numbers of people who have no connection or very tenuous connection at best to Western societies, what happens is that they transform the local area to be more like their host societies. It's this sort of goes back and forth with the we keep inviting, for example, say a large number of refugees streaming into Europe. These people are coming from societies that they think that the process of becoming Western is just a matter of living in an area. But it's as you and other figures in the alt-right have emphasized, this culture is a creation of history going back hundreds of years. We're talking about people who come from societies, for example. The idea of Western democracy and the idea of liberty did not just spontaneously bloom out of nowhere. It was a continuous process going back to, say, the Magna Carta, the Renaissance, etc. Processes which many of these peoples have not undergone. So when you, say, bring in a ton of refugees from the Arab world into Europe, suddenly, all of a sudden, sections of Germany are starting to look like the places they fled from. Or when you bring in tons of Mexicans from the United States, I can walk like 2 blocks to the west and see basically a little representation of Mexico right here in my hometown. It's a process that needs to, if not be stopped entirely, be severely revised if America wants to continue being, America.
One of the fundamental misconceptions of the left, and in some respects it's now a misconception of conservatism as well, is that environment predominates over genetic heritage. It is absolute dogma among our rulers and our official opinion makers that all races are genetically absolutely and perfectly equal. There are even some people who would suggest that human beings, at least when it comes to personality and intelligence, are all blank slates when they're born, and it is environment exclusively that creates what they become. This is absolute scientific lunacy. There are mountains and mountains of evidence to prove that this is wrong. But this is an article of faith. It's an article of faith of the religion of egalitarianism, which one of my South African friends, Dan Root, suggests is, after militant Islam, probably the most powerful religion in the world. And it's a religion that is adhered to by the people who run every white society except for a number of happy places in Eastern Europe. That is the thinking behind the idea that you can bring in large numbers of Somali Bantus into the United States, or you can bring large numbers of Syrians into Germany, and then in a generation, or maybe if we're patient, a generation or two, they will become good little Americans or a good little Germans. The point that I have frequently made to people who take this view is that it's all very well to assume that this is going to happen, but look at the history of the United States. Ever since 1620, I guess, when the first blacks came, we have had 3 racial groups in this country: Indians, white people, and blacks. And despite the fact that they've been here hundreds of years, would anyone really believe that Indians and blacks have assimilated into an indistinguishable America in which their blackness or their Indianness doesn't matter at all? No one would believe this. The other argument I like to make is, for those who say that these Middle Easterners or these Central American Indians, that they can come to the West and become just like Americans and Germans, I'd like to ask them, well, can you imagine emigrating to, say, Cambodia or Saudi Arabia? How many generations would it take for you and your descendants to be utterly indistinguishable from Saudi Arabians or from Cambodians? This is a shock to them because they've never thought of it in those terms. And I think it is very, very difficult for white Americans to imagine assimilating in any kind of meaningful way to Cambodian society, Saudi Arabian society, even Japanese society, certainly no place like Jordan or Syria or Tasmania. No, they would never feel at home in those places. If that's the case, why do they think that Tasmanians or Trobriand Islanders can come to the West and become Westerners? Why can it only work one way? As soon as you sow doubt in their mind as it working in the other direction, of them becoming something non-Western, then I think that plants the seed in their mind that it might not be working so successfully in the other direction either.
Yes, and it's, I have also some personal experience in this department. A couple of years ago, I lived for a brief time in the Philippines, and I also visited Japan. And the Philippines, by Asian standards, is a relatively xenophilic country. English is the official language there, a legacy of American colonialism, and Filipinos tend to be very outgoing and gregarious towards foreigners. Yet, even there, I felt like I would never be able to assimilate, even if I tried. I would always be a foreigner. It's
of course not. No. I was born in Japan. I lived in Japan until I was 16 years old. I speak fluent Japanese. Over the phone, Japanese wouldn't know that I was not Japanese. And Japan is a democracy. They have many of the trappings of Western civilization. They adore Shakespeare. They adore Beethoven. But I, as an Occidental, a round eye, it would be impossible for me to be a Japanese. And Japanese understand that. They don't consider this something hateful. They don't consider this something unfortunate. It's just a fact of biology. You cannot look like me and be Japanese in any real sense. Even if I speak fluent Japanese, even if I have lived there all my life, I am not Japanese. They have the good sense to understand that race is an impermeable barrier to genuine integration. It's this failure of whites all across the West to understand the importance of race that has led to all of this suicidal folly on the part of the people who consider themselves our leaders, but who will ultimately be our executioners.
Yes, and this seems like kind of a basic one-on-one type question, but do you have any theories on why whites and whites only seem to think like this? Because as you've pointed out, in many of these countries, Asian countries, not only can you're not going to be able to assimilate. In many cases, they don't even want you to be assimilated. You can't even become a citizen as an immigrant to Japan or the Philippines or wherever. It's whites and whites only who have this idea that if you just move someone from a completely different culture into a white country, they'll magically, through osmosis, absorb the surrounding culture. Any theories as to why this is?
I've thought about this for years. And when you think of it in a historical perspective, this disease is relatively new. It's only in the last, 50, 60, maybe if you go back 70 years, you could find some people thinking in these terms. But for most of our history, white people would have recoiled at the idea that their society could be composed of any but Europeans, any but people like themselves. So what is it that has happened to drive us into this lemming-like state, which will lead to our oblivion if we don't somehow change it? There are lots of theories about this. One theory is that the 2 world wars, they were devastating both physically and psychologically to whites. I think there's a lot of truth to that. These were our Peloponnesian Wars. Greece never recovered from its Peloponnesian Wars. And in a way, I think white people never psychologically recovered from the First World War. they thought to themselves, this was such a catastrophe. There must be something wrong with us. And then, not many years after that, we had another horrible cataclysm. Europe has torn itself apart in these horrible, horrible, heart-rending ways, and that this could have been a source of demoralization to whites. Another theory is that Christianity, because of its universalism, its idea that we are all children of God, and once we recognize that we are children of God, all other distinctions fall away. That is one theory about what has denatured us. Another theory is that Jews and their machinations have somehow tricked white people into self-hatred and into undertaking all of these ventures that will lead to their demise. I'm not satisfied with any of these explanations, either individually or in combination. Sometimes I think that whites have a certain nature, and it's a nature that assumes reciprocal value. And let me try to explain that rather abstract position. When you think of the hallmarks of the West, you think of such things as democracy, one man, one vote. You think of such things as freedom of speech. You think of such things as the rule of law. All of these are based on the notion that every man has a point of view. Even if you are much more powerful and wealthier than I, the law should apply to you just as it applies to me. This is a Western concept. This notion that each of us has a kind of reciprocal state of mutual respect. The way we treat women, this too is unique. We respect women in ways that Orientals, Africans, Muslims obviously do not. Women have a point of view. The little guy has a point of view. We care about the planet in ways that others do not. We care about other species. We want to save the Kreshmar cave mold beetle, for heaven's sake. And you can't build on your land if you might disturb this little beetle. We want to save the whales. The Japanese, who are just as wealthy as us, want to eat the whales. All of these positions, all of these hallmarks of the West have this notion that the other person must be respected. He has an opinion that we must at least listen to and consider. He has a status. He has a right. The fact of monogamy, for example. For hundreds of years in the West, a man just had one wife, because it is unfair if the wealthy man has 10 wives and then there are 9 poor men who go without wives. This too is unique. Look at world history. Look at world societies. The idea that we must share the women equitably. This is a radical concept, and it's again based on this notion that even the poor man, the weak man, every man has certain rights that we must respect. Now, I think that these are good things when this conception of reciprocity and mutual respect remains within the tribe, which it did for hundreds of years, 1,000 years. It's when this sense of reciprocity jumps the track and we decide that Zulus and Bantus and people from Nicaragua, they too have the same right to our sense of fairness and reciprocity. That's where we go haywire. That's when we start thinking in terms that will only lead to our destruction. But if this really is part of our nature, and I think it's to some degree it is part of our nature. It's the sort of thing that Tacitus discovered when he visited the Germans, that they had this sense of equality. They respected their women. They had each man would come to the assembly with his weapons, and he had his voice in decision making. This notion of respecting the other man, the other species, the other sex. This has been perverted into a respect of the other culture, of the other race, of the other religion, in a way that I think is an important part, a very important ingredient to our march to oblivion.
It's interesting that you bring up Tacitus observing the same traits among the Germans thousands of years ago. We've seen this sort of universalism among whites, not just among whites, but specifically among certain ethnicities of whites. As I said, the Germans, Scandinavians, and etc. And we'll be talking a bit more about the presidential election, but we've actually seen the same divide in the United States among voters in the Republican primary. The Twitter free speech activist and nationalist Ricky Vaughn did a breakdown of the white ethnicities, which ones tend to support Donald Trump, who is an openly nationalist candidate, and which ones tend to support anti-Trump. And the Danish, Norwegians, Swedes, Germans, Dutch consistently tended to be anti-Trump. That was in part why Trump lost Wisconsin, which was a very a pivotal state near the end of the campaign. Wisconsin is was largely settled by Germans, whereas the pro-Trump groups tend to be Scots-Irish, Italians, French Canadians, Poles, etc. It's interesting that this nature has been around for quite some time, even if it wasn't formally articulated in philosophy and whatnot. Now, Jared, do you think whites are facing an existential threat to their very existence? In Europe we have the refugee crisis, and in the United States we have illegal immigration, and just immigration in general being much higher than this country can sustain. Do you think there's a possibility of whites being able to sort of recognize that? Sort of turn back these problems and assure their existence. I mean, we've seen a remarkable amount of progress in this department with the rise of Donald Trump and other nationalist parties in Europe. What do you project for the future along these lines?
I'm more optimistic now than I have been at any point in 25 years of trying to wake white people up to this terrible crisis that they face. I think that Donald Trump is certainly an important ingredient in that. I think even without Donald Trump, though, there has been a huge proliferation of websites, of podcasts, of video production, publishers. We have a whole sector of thought, of groups, of a message that is out and available to people in a way that was never the case before. The truth is more easily available than any time in the last 50 or 60 years. And much of what we are producing in terms of ideas, podcasts, videos, etc., books, is of very high quality, very persuasive. When I was first learning about racial reality, and I grew up a conventional liberal, and I abandoned conventional liberalism with a great struggle and with great regret. But in those days, 30 or 40 years ago, you had to write off to obscure P.O. boxes to find subversive literature. You had to scratch around in the dusty corners of university libraries to find books that had written before the Iron Curtain fell on realistic talk about race. It was a much greater effort. Today, with a few clicks of a mouse, a young white man can stumble onto a wonderfully diverse and rich selection of introductions and then even graduate courses in what it is to be a white man today and why what we are taught in school right from kindergarten is poison and must be washed out of our systems. It's never been easier for people to see the light. And that's a huge, huge thing, and we see the effects all the time. I'm always meeting young white guys in their 20s, some of them in their teens. They understand race in a thorough and consistent and well-formed way that I didn't understand until I was 35, maybe in my late 30s. There is a remarkable progress in that respect that has nothing to do with Donald Trump. Of course, I don't want to underplay his importance. He is a guy who cannot be shut up. And when he says, what do we need more Muslims for? Well, that becomes part of the national dialogue. I've been saying for 25 years we don't need any more Muslims. But I can be ignored. The SPLC can say I'm a hate monger, and then people will ignore me. The SPLC can say all it wants that Donald Trump is a hate monger, but if he is the Republican nominee, then he is in an entirely different position. And when people start thinking in those terms, well, wait a minute, are Muslims really of any use to the United States? Then the next step, of course, is to say, well, are there any other groups that are of no use to the United States? What do, Guatemalans, for example, bring to our country? What do Somalis bring to our country? What do Haitians bring to America? Do we really need 30 million Mexicans living in this country? When you start thinking in terms of group differences, then the camel's nose is under the tent. That opens the door to all kinds of anti-orthodox, subversive thinking. And so Donald Trump has played a huge role in breaking down the gates of orthodoxy and making it possible to raise these questions in a way that they've never been raised at a level at which they've never been raised ever before.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I've only been involved in this part of the internet, this struggle, as you will, for about 5-7 years. But I've seen this huge change. To give an example, I was at the National Policy Institute's conference in March, and when Richard Spencer did a roll call near the end of it, there were a ton of guys there, maybe about at least a quarter to a third, or like I just found out about the alt-right 6 months ago. There's been a huge influx of interest in our ideas, and I legitimately feel hope for the first time since I started getting involved in this. But we're about at the midway point, so we're going to take a quick break. The second segment, Jared and I will be discussing more about the Donald Trump campaign and its benefits for the alt-right and its effect on nationalism and white identity, and we'll also be talking about the American Renaissance Conference and other topics. But we're going to take a quick break. I'll be back in a few minutes. I'm Matt Forney, and you're listening to This Alt-Right Life. Okay, welcome back to This Alt-Right Life. I'm speaking to Jared Taylor, founder and editor of American Renaissance. Now, as we got into the last segment, Jared, the Donald Trump campaign and his the fact that he's an openly nationalist candidate has resulted in a flurry of interest from the mainstream media in our movement, as it were. Now, it's quite interesting, too, because Trump is not despite what his enemies claim, he is not a white nationalist or any kind of racialist. He's a civic nationalist. For example, they claim that, for example, he's an anti-Semite, even though his daughter is a convert to Judaism. He's not, but he's making an open appeal to America as a country with its own interests, and he's the only candidate on either side who's doing that. What are your thoughts on a potential Donald Trump presidency and the effects he would have for America and for whites in general?
It's very hard to say, of course. We like to believe that he will follow through on his promises, that he will build a wall, that he will expel all the illegals, that he will even temporarily stop immigration of Muslims. It would be wonderful if he did these things, and he might very well. These are the trademarks of his campaign, as well as other things such as bringing industrial jobs back to the United States. He has other appeals. But for us, those are, to me, the three main aspects of his appeal. I think that he has committed himself so strongly to those ideas that it would look very bad if he were to back out on them. Even if he did only those things and nothing more. That would be a radical transformation of the way America does politics when it comes to immigration. And that would be a wonderful thing. We can then imagine a Donald Trump who goes even further. Donald Trump is the only candidate in the last 50 years of whom I could realistically imagine his tossing off to a group of journalists a question such as, well, what's wrong with white people and wanting to remain a majority in their country? I can imagine him saying that. He will not necessarily, but I can imagine it. I cannot imagine any other candidate ever saying such a thing. I can even imagine him saying, well, ultimately, you just can't expect as many blacks per capita to be in the advanced placement courses because they're just not as smart. I mean, I can imagine that with a little bit greater difficulty than the remark about being majorities. But that, too, is not an utterly inconceivable thing for Donald Trump to say. And if the President of the United States makes remarks of that kind, they simply cannot be brushed aside. I mean, I've been making that kind of remark, as I say, for 25 years. I can be ignored by the mainstream. The President cannot. And he is a person who is actually, I think, perhaps capable of saying such things. Now, I agree 100% with you. He is not a sophisticated racialist. He does not have a well-formulated understanding of the significance of race, the biology of race, the inextricable relationship between race and culture. I don't think he sees the world in those terms. What I see in Donald Trump is simply good instincts. He has good instincts that have survived all this onslaught of egalitarianism, this multiculti lunacy. None of that has been able to beat out of Donald Trump the notion that groups of people are in fact different, that America is a country that deserves our support because it's America and it's ours and it's our country, rather than thinking that America should play some sort of self-sacrificing role for the benefit of the world at large. These are two things that set him at complete odds with the entire political class. And that, of course, is why the entire political class has been so aghast that the American people have aligned themselves behind Donald Trump. So, again, I can't read his mind. I don't know really, really deep down inside what makes him tick. He has switched positions on so many things, it's conceivable that he could switch position on many things in ways that would disappoint us. Just recently, for example, he told some talk show host that the whole idea of restricting Muslims, it was just sort of an idea that he tossed out. He seemed to be pedaling away from it, despite the fact that strong majorities, certainly of Republican voters, and a very substantial number of Democratic voters agree with him that Muslims should be kept out. Now, I hope he then switches back to a much stronger view on these things. But he's something of an erratic guy. He doesn't have a carefully thought out view of the world. So it's difficult to know in which direction he'll go. On the other hand, there is an aspect of this that very few people are talking about. If there actually is a Trump presidency, he will attract at all sorts of levels in his administration people who do think the way we do, even though they're not publicly associated with racial dissidence or white advocacy. He will attract people who read our web pages, who listen to our podcasts, and they will work in all sorts of very, very useful ways in all levels of his administration to bring about sensible policies. I think I can also imagine that some of them, they will be caught out, saying rude things about blacks or rude things about Mexico. And there will be little scandals here and there. But there will be a great number who will infiltrate his administration, his campaign, his advisors in ways that cannot but be extremely useful both to Trump and to us.
Yes, I mean, the most intelligent criticism I've heard of Trump from the Never Trump crowd, if you can call it that, is that he's erratic and kind of flighty. As you've said, he's changed his positions on some things over the years and during the campaign. But with him, we have with his open nationalist appeal and the fact that he's not owned by the same special interests that own, say, Hillary Clinton or Ted Cruz or every other politician, and who benefit from free trade agreements that hurt the American worker and benefit from increased immigration. The fact that he's not controlled by those people means, and the fact that he built a campaign on these nationalist appeals, which conventional wisdom would tell us are very unpopular, indicate that we have a better chance with him of getting these things done than with anyone else. You're certainly not going to get an end to illegal immigration and restrictions on H-1B visas or whatever from someone like, say, Ted Cruz, who, as it was reported earlier in the week, several of the donors who are supporting his campaign are now supporting Hillary Clinton. They go from supporting a guy who emphasized that he was a constitutional conservative and was going to uphold the letter of the law to Hillary Clinton, who basically represents everything that conservatives and everyone to the right should despise. Trump represents shaking up of the way Washington does business, and that's the main reason why he's been so popular, and also why he's been able to get people who are disengaged from the political system involved. I mean, I'm a perfect example. I had stopped the last time I voted before I voted in this election was 2011. I stopped voting because I saw it as pointless. We bring in the Republicans; they don't do anything to on the illegal immigration issue or on free trade or whatever. I re-registered to vote so I could vote for Trump in the Illinois primary, because Trump represents the best chance we have through the political system of turning this the current dystopia around.
I agree. I think that Trump has put a whole lot of noses out of joint because he's simply not part of their class. He could be smooth as silk. He could be cultured. He could be, suave and a man whom all the ladies love and who has never said an offensive word about anybody. But the fact that he unthroned Jeb Bush, that he has no political experience at all of this, I think, is deeply shocking, deeply insulting to them. Here's a guy who's never even run for dog catcher, and he thinks he can be president. I think that's part of it. Of course, it's infinitely worse because he has said so many things that violate all the taboos. To actually look at the flow of immigrants from Mexico and point out, yes, there are murderers. Yes, there are rapists. I mean, this is obvious. It's obvious that this is true. And if we had a functioning immigration policy, we would screen immigrants. We wouldn't have a single murderer. We wouldn't have a single rapist if we had a real functioning immigration policy. But to point out the obvious fact and to use Mexicans, a non-white group, this shocks the sensibilities, not just of Democrats, but of Republicans. So he has upset them in any number of ways. But again, we'll just have to see what he ends up being as a real chief executive, what his foreign policies will be. I think that one aspect of this that really speaks to the extent to which Americans are fed up with their government is the fact that insurgent candidacies in both parties, Bernie Sanders in the Democrats and Donald Trump in the Republicans, have been so successful. Everyone's attitude seems to be, throw these swine out. They have ruled us and misruled us for too long. Anybody but a Washington insider seems to be the great desire of so many voters today. Now, one aspect of the Republican reaction, the official dinosaur Republican reaction to Donald Trump that particularly amuses me, these are the people who roar all around the world, shooting people in the name of democracy, in the name of nation building, in the name of one man, one vote, listening to the people. These very people who brag about American democracy and who think we are a model for the world, these are the very people who were scheming to snatch the nomination from Donald Trump, who is obviously the people's choice for the Republicans. What a joke. What a joke. They want to upset the democratic process if it doesn't go their way. What pathetic hypocrites.
Yes, we still have desperate Trump haters from the, shall we say, conservative wing of the GOP trying to demand a contested convention, or we'll run some guy from Nebraska no one's heard of as a third party candidate so we can have a principled choice. It's everything they go to the point of Trump didn't win the majority of Republican voters. Well, neither did anyone else.
The other aspect, of course, is that the political class is always wringing its hands over low voter turnout. Well, Donald Trump is a man who has resulted in record voter turnout. Isn't he the best thing that democracy has produced in decades? Again, the utter hypocrisy of people who claim to believe in respecting the will of the people, who then absolutely flout on the will of the people, spit on the will of the people when it doesn't go their way. Oh, the sickening, transparent hypocrisy of this is so clear to people that I think the Republican Party, in some respects, will never recover even just from that low-down, scurvy, scheming way of trying to think that they're going to deprive the Republican voters of the candidate they obviously want.
Well, they've been subdued for the moment, so fortunately,
yes, they're subdued. Well, they've been steamrollered. Yes, Donald Trump turned out to be an unstoppable juggernaut, and they're utterly baffled and humiliated and licking their wounds. But if Donald Trump is the president, then you know for sure all of these people will come. They will come streaming back, tail between their legs, wanting to lick his hand, kiss his toe. That is the way power works in the United States. All the people who have said the country is going to completely go down the drain, they will see that it does not go down the drain. All the people who are threatening to emigrate or announce U.S. citizenship, well, as far as those people, I'm happy to let them go if that's what they feel, if that's how they feel. Most of them will not do that. I don't think even one in 1,000 will do that. Yeah, this is all just braggadocio and happy talk.
Yeah, everyone who's threatening to move to Canada, if Trump becomes the president, they forgot that a threat is supposed to be something that we don't want. But you brought up Bernie Sanders in the last segment, how his candidacy has sort of been doing the same thing in the Democratic side. We're overturning an establishment-approved, donor-owned insider hack like Hillary Clinton, and I've been covering the election for Right On and Return of Kings for a few months now, and I was present covering the Iowa caucuses. One of the sort of underrated aspects of Trump's campaign is that he's addressing the issue of NAFTA and these unfair trade agreements that have absolutely devastated white America. I have some personal experience in this because I grew up in Syracuse, New York, which is a city that was built on during the Industrial Revolution as a manufacturing hub. General Motors and Carrier had major plants there. All of that's gone now. From what last I heard, the city has not only lost a huge amount of its population, about a third of the remaining citizens are living below the poverty line, and we've seen, in particular, in places like upstate New York, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, etc., white people have been absolutely not just politically disenfranchised, by the left, calling them racist and claiming that they're responsible for all the world's ills, but economic disenfranchisement as well. Years ago, I worked for the New York State Labor Department, and one of the this is kind of funny, but the government at the time was trying to assess whether the programs that the Labor Department ran to help people get jobs were actually working. So they would send me in to just take the programs as from the perspective of someone who's trying to get a job and report on their effectiveness. And one week I was sent to a Labor Department office up near the Canadian border, Canton, New York, and I was in a program that was designed to help unemployed job seekers create email addresses and use Microsoft Word. Now, this was in the year 2013, and you still have people who don't know how to use email. I'm thinking to myself, why would anyone need help with this? And the answer was evident as soon as I walked in the door. We're talking about white factory workers who are in their late 50s. Many of them don't even have high school degrees. They're not. I don't mean to say this as being insulting or whatever, but it's, a statement of fact. They're not very smart. They're good people. They worked for the factory their entire lives, had a good middle class upbringing. They married, had kids. But when at the near the end of their life, the factory decides to up and move to Mexico or China, wherever, and they are out of work. Their retirement was bound up in the company, so they don't get that, and they have to retool. But many of them they don't even own computers. They talk about using email, and they have to retool and learn an entirely new skill set. And for what exactly? To become a Walmart greeter, because that's the only economic activity that's happening in that part of New York. And the entire experience just broke my heart. You've got people who've obeyed done right by themselves for the better part of their lives, followed the law, live normal lives, family lives, had everything taken away from them at the end of their life. They're expected to retool at the period in which the human brain is less capable of internalizing new skills. And for what? For a minimum wage job, telling people who enter Walmart, welcome to Walmart, happy to have you here or whatever, And you've got so-called conservatives like National Review arguing that these white people who, as it turned out, are massively supporting Donald Trump because he's promising to bring jobs back, saying that, well, they're just a bunch of drug-addled, bumpkins. They need to U-Haul and move to the big city, It's that's really another aspect of why Trump I feel is a major benefit to this country.
Well, that is certainly a big part of his appeal to a large part of the electorate. I'm always pondering in my mind to what extent that is driving it, and to what extent the semi-racialist positions that Donald Trump takes are driving his candidacy. I would like to think that the semi-racialist positions are very much the predominant part. But it is perfectly likely that it's those folks who have lost their jobs because industrial jobs have moved overseas who are supporting him. Now, I'm really something of two minds about this. The wealth of a nation really does depend on the productivity of its people. If we discount such things as natural resources and good farmland, good ports on two oceans, we are physically a very blessed nation. At the same time, though, as we become a nation largely of Mexicans, largely of Caribbeans, largely of people who do not share our culture and who do not achieve the same educational levels as whites, we will not be productive. We will not be competitive. And some whites will fall by the wayside in terms of competitiveness as well. I don't think that the solution is to set up barriers to trade. I don't think the solution is to prevent American companies from seeking cheaper labor overseas, although I would like them to have some patriotic sense of Americanness that does keep jobs in the United States, even if they can get a lower wage overseas. The really important thing is to have a population like that of Switzerland or Denmark, people who are very well educated, very productive, who can sustain the kind of sophisticated economy, even a sophisticated industrial economy. That is what you have to compete in the world today. In any case, this is a different subject matter. How really are we to change the economy in a way that benefits Americans, but we also have to change Americans in a way that benefits the economy. On just a different note entirely, I believe the term alt-right is part of your radio program. But I have, although my opinion doesn't matter for much, I have something of a bone to pick with that very expression. Now, I think when you think of the alternatives, if beer is an alternative to wine, or, I don't know, the way the trendy lefties talk about homosexuality is an alternative to heterosexuality, that these are things that can go either way. To me, the way we view the world is not an alternative. It's not an alternative in the way that life is an alternative to death. Take it either way, or that good health is just sort of a random take it or leave it alternative to sickness. We're right. We're not just some sort of alternative. And so the idea that we are an alternative, that sticks in my craw a bit. The other is that we are not necessarily of the right. I think that a healthy racial view is what is at the center of what is called the alternative right. But a healthy racial view is not necessarily rightist in the sense of leftist or rightist. You need go back only to, say, the 1920s to find that people who were progressives, who were leftists in their day, were those who were very powerfully in favor of eugenics, for example. And if we are to have a racial homeland, we are going to have a racial homeland that's going to have a left and a right. It is entirely possible to be a big government gay rights activist who nevertheless understands race. So I think that in the long run, we restrict our appeal by associating ourselves with the right. And also, I don't like the idea that we are an alternative. We are the solution. We're not an alternative. An alternative like, as I say, beer as opposed to wine. We're right. We have the truth. We have morality. We have history. We have human nature on our side. And those who do not are not an alternative. They're just simply wrong.
Yeah, this is not like some sort of choice between whether you should have a hamburger or a hot dog for dinner. This is the truth. That is interesting. I mean, I have no real opinions on the term one way or the other. The reason this show is actually, I should reveal this to the listeners right now. The reason why this program is called This Alt-Right Life is because it was a riff off of NPR's This American Life, and we were originally going to go with something based off of All Things Considered, but we couldn't come up with a play on it that was either funny or safe for work, as it were. But that's an interesting point in regards to the left-right spectrum and racialism.
You could have called it This Dissident Life. We are dissidents, and I like to use the term racial dissident sometimes to describe myself, because the dissidents under Soviet communism, they were considered heroes. They were oppressed by their regime, just as the way we are repressed by our regime. For years, they had to circulate their ideas in samizdat, these mimeographed sheets that were produced in basements. They were these romantic, brave people bucking the system. And I like to somehow steal some of the reflected glory from the dissidents and patch it onto our movement, because in many respects, we're the same. We are persecuted. For the longest time, we did have to sort of hand around mimeographed sheets. Now we have access to the internet and much better means of getting our ideas across. But I like the idea of being a dissident, because that is precisely what we are, and the word itself is in such high regard, even on the left.
We may have to rename it the show again after this episode. But it's interesting that you bring up the left-right spectrum and racialism. Racialist views have become associated with the right, I guess, in part because not just guess, but no, because the left has just really accelerated towards radical egalitarianism or whatever you want to call it. It would. Do you ever think it might be possible? I mean, this sort of dovetails into what we were discussing before with free trade, NAFTA, and the Bernie Sanders campaign. The Bernie Sanders campaign is implicitly, if not explicitly, white. And despite his attempts to pander to identity politics, the identity politics of the left, Hillary Clinton has run a very divisive campaign focused on gay rights. In fact, I went to one of her speeches in Des Moines, and bizarrely enough, she's talking about she's made getting HIV medication to people with HIV a major plank in her identity politics push, where Sanders has talked mainly about economics. And despite his feeble attempts to cater to sort of Black Lives Matter and whatnot, his voter base has remained primarily white. This can be broken down in exit polls. For example, in New York State, which Hillary won, Sanders actually won. They actually split the white male vote. I think he won white men, and they split the white vote 50-50. Might have been slightly in favor of Sanders. The reason why she won the state, however, was because minorities, blacks and Hispanics, voted for Hillary over Sanders by like 75-25.
For the life of me, I don't understand how Hillary Clinton can appeal to black people. I just do not get it. Her husband, of course, they used to joke about how he was the first black president. But what has Hillary Clinton ever done for black people? I have no sense whatsoever that she even likes black people. If she's going to let her hair down and have a beer with somebody, if she ever does such a thing, would she let her hair down and have beer with a black person? I cannot imagine it. I just can't imagine it. What sort of trickery has she used to convince black people that she's somehow better than any other white person? Certainly, why is she any better than Bernie Sanders? I just don't get it. This seems to be some sort of voodoo that she manages to work on blacks, and not just blacks, but Hispanics too.
I think it in part has to do with the goodwill they had from Bill Clinton, who was touted as the first black president. And also there was an article from V there that sort of pointed out the fact that blacks and Hispanics are less civically engaged, and in contests like this, they tend to support the candidate who is more widely known, more of an establishment candidate. The only real exception in recent times we can think of was Barack Obama in 2008, and that's because Obama was the first major black candidate running for a major party presidential nomination who had a shot. So
Sure. But to get the lopsided vote of the Hispanics and the blacks that way, if they were really paying attention to Bernie Sanders' program, I think they would recognize that he is just as much, if not more so, a redistributionist. He would beef up their checks. He would make life easier for them. I think more so than Hillary Clinton would. It's rather a mystery to me, just as it's a mystery to me as to why it is that all the black leaders these days, the so-called leaders, are in favor of amnesty, are in favor of more Hispanics. Their voters, ordinary blacks, certainly are not. And back in 1986, when Ronald Reagan signed the first amnesty, the Black Congressional Caucus was absolutely against it for all the right reasons. Who needs these Mexicans? They're taking away our jobs. They're a problem. Now, they seem to think that, I suppose their thinking is that with more Mexicans, more Guatemalans and Haitians and Hondurans and more whoever they are, it'll be this rainbow coalition against the white man. Well, boy, they're in for a big surprise if Hispanics ever start running the country. Hispanics are not going to sit still for their sob stories about slavery.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Hispanic immigration has massively hit blacks, in many ways harder than it has hit whites.
Yes.
And that's that they're competing for the same low-wage jobs. Yes.
Exactly. Blacks should be the most ferociously anti-third world immigrant constituency in the whole country. And most of the time, when you look at the way the blacks vote, they're pretty good about voting for people who will give them more cake. But in this case, if they're voting for people who want to open the doors, they're voting for their own hangman's noose. It's something that's mysterious to me.
Yeah, I mean, I have no answer to this question either. I mean, but we're approaching the end of the program, and the third edition of the publication, The Color of Crime, was recently released. Jared, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Certainly. Yes, this is the 2016 revised edition. And what it does is look into government statistics, mainly from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but also from many states and cities that gather statistics. And the whole purpose is to discover how the races differ in terms of criminal activity. And in some cases, the results are absolutely staggering. If you look at big cities like Chicago or New York, you will find that blacks are committing murder, for example, at 30 times the white rate, muggings at 35, 40 times the white rate. And when it comes to a crime called shooting, in New York, there's a crime called a shooting, and that is when you fire a gun and the bullet hits some person. Doesn't have to kill him, just hits some person. Blacks are 100 times more likely to be guilty of this crime than whites. You almost never find sociological multiples of such a huge order. But the result is that if you could imagine a city like Chicago or a city like New York City, in which it was all white, and all of the whites, the additional whites who replaced the non-whites, were committing crime at the same rates as the whites who are living there today, then murder would decline by 90%, muggings down by 80%, shootings down 95, 98%. You could fire 3/4 of the police force. So these are some of the most dramatic findings. But I think another very significant finding in this revised edition is that it ultimately and finally refutes the view that the only reason Hispanics have higher crime rates than whites is because they are younger and more likely to be in the higher crime age brackets. Ron Unz, who is a very smart guy and is very much a dissident in some respects, has argued very persuasively in the views of some that that's what accounts for high crime. It's not really any racial difference. It's the fact that there are more 17 to 25-year-olds among Hispanics than whites proportionally. That's not the case. We have statistics that are very carefully kept by the state of California, that show that although Hispanics are not nearly as crime-prone as blacks, in all age groups, in all crimes, with only just a few aberrant exceptions, Hispanics commit more crime than whites. That's just an open and shut black and white case. But again, they are certainly intermediate between whites and blacks in that respect, and closer to whites than they are to blacks in terms of criminal rates. And then, as usual, we have found that Asians, and unfortunately this includes this hodgepodge of Pacific Islanders and Samoans and oddbods who really do have rather high crime rates, but the North Asians, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Japanese, they commit most crimes at approximately 1/3 to 1/4 the white rate. This is just a finding that you find everywhere. Every city, every state, national statistics, Asians just commit fewer crimes, and it's not just violent crimes. Now, there is one crime in which Asians are at the top of the heap, and this will be a test of the extent to which you are a genuine connoisseur of racial stereotypes if you can guess which crime that is.
Gambling fraud?
Good for you. Very good. Gambling offenses. The Chinese love to gamble. and they don't see why they have to have some kind of license or some sort of special dispensation from the government to set up a gambling den. They're just going to do it whenever they feel like it. And yes, they are off the charts in terms of gambling. Well, good for you. You are one of the few who have answered that question correctly. You get the dog biscuit.
Well, being a dissident, as it were, has benefited me in more ways than one. But this is important information to get out, mainly because the left has been the obscurantism from the left on this issue has really made a lot of people stupid, to put it politely. I mean, I can't count the number of times that I've sort of tried to point out these sorts of statistics on Twitter or whatever, and people will be like, "Well, white people commit crimes too." It's like, I forget the exact phrasing that I was just going to use, but it's like the left has this. I'm not sure whether it's overtly malicious or they just have this refusal to just see. Like I can see with my own eyes. I mean, just a few months ago, I live in the Chicago neighborhood of Rogers Park, which is a relatively safe neighborhood. But I once was treated to the prospect of a couple of thugs, black thugs or teenagers, beating up a elderly white man in the alleyway behind my building. I saw it from my window. They were trying to commit a B&E, and the guy tried to scare him off, and when the police were being called, they just beat him up out of pure spite and then ran. You know, I can see this with my own eyes. You know, one of my friends joked that Chicago is really two cities in one. The South Side, where it's just where blacks primarily live, is like Detroit, whereas the North Side is like Toronto. But you know, we can. It doesn't require too much brain power to understand these differences, but it's just that people are so committed to avoiding, you know, the truth that's plainly in front of their eyes.
Well, yes, this deliberate blindness to the truth is one of the most shocking aspects of the way the country is run. I was in a debate last month with a black professor at Kentucky State University, which is a historically black college, as they like to put it these days. And one of the questions had to do with Michael Brown. And I started to recite the circumstances of the Michael Brown shooting. I'd said, well, first of all, he was high on marijuana. He had just strong-armed the owner of a convenience store. And that is as far as I got. And I was absolutely drowned out by hooting and shouting by this black audience that did not want to hear about how Michael Brown had assaulted a police officer, tried to take his gun away from him, was charging it. They didn't want to hear the facts. The facts were something that was the last thing they were interested in. And this, to me, is one of the most pathetic and contemptible aspects of our ruling ideology, is that it hushes up inconvenient facts and it tells outright lies. But they have to, because they're wrong and we're right.
Yeah, I mean, and getting this information out there is a massive public service for those of us. Now,
just one more aspect about the color of crime. We go into the statistics about police shootings of blacks, armed or unarmed, and it is obvious that the great and abiding menace to black men is other black men. It's not police at all. Of course, black men can shoot each other by the thousand every year, but you get a handful of even faintly or remotely ambiguous police killings, and then it's a national scandal. No, the disproportions of this, the selective outrage, it's just contemptible. But even more contemptible is the way that the American media, largely run by whites, has slobbered over this black activism.
Yeah, in many ways, I mean, I hate to sound dramatic, but in many ways it seems like they're trying to foment race war. I mean, I had to witness this firsthand back around Thanksgiving when the Laquan McDonald story broke. For those of you who don't know, Laquan McDonald was shot here in Chicago by a police officer when he was high on PCP and had been running around trying to slash tires with a knife. And a cop shot him because he thought he was a threat to his safety. Now, there's a reasonable argument to be made that the officer used too much force, but the release of the shooting video just prior to Thanksgiving just caused the entire city just to erupt in protest. Black Lives Matter people all over the place. They were shutting down. I was actually tagging along as a reporter with one of the protests. This happened the day before Thanksgiving. We were going through the city, and we went through Millennium Park, which had a Christmas tree set up. You had people who were like jumping onto the Christmas tree, trying to pull the lights off. They were kicking down police barricades. They were pounding on windows of bars that were open and trying to harass people. And I, in fact, had to duck out of I wrote about this for Right On. Look for the article. I think it's called Black Lives Matter, the New American Red Guard, in which I actually had to duck out of the protest because for some reason a bunch of Black Panther types, they falsely accused me of being a cop in disguise. And when you have a bunch of people who have been whipped up in a frenzy against the cops, screaming maniacally, when the cops show up to monitor the protest, they get up in the cops' face and they're screaming at them. It could have very easily developed into a mob type situation. Yet when it comes to blacks shooting each other, they don't have anything to say.
Mm. Oh, the mob could just see the white privilege and the white hate in your eyes. That's what it was.
Yeah, it was. And I wish I'd gotten some more video of it, but the problem was my phone battery died pretty early on. But it was a pretty frightening experience. I mean, I actually had to sort of duck through to make sure I wasn't being followed. But yeah. That would cover the color of crime, and we're just about the end of the program. Now, the American Renaissance Conference is happening just a few days from now, 3 days to be exact. Jared, do you want to talk a bit about this year's AmRen and what attendees have in store?
Oh, gosh. They'll have a wonderful time. They will have a lovely weekend of fellowship May 20th through 22nd at Montgomery Bell State Park. At a moment when the state park is at its most beautiful. It's going to be a record turnout. There'll probably be nearly 300 people there. And we'll get a first-class group of speakers. It will really be, there's so much excitement and so much energy in our movement. It seems that it's almost been focused on this coming weekend of the 20th to the 22nd. We may even have to eventually start turning people away because we're bursting at the seams, and we might be violating the fire codes with the number of people that we're going to be packing into this place. But we're not yet at that point, and if any of your listeners are interested in registering, they can come to our page at AmRen.com.
Yeah.
And I wish you every luck with this dissident life. And if you're inclined to have me back on again sometime, I'd be glad to be one of your guests. So.
Oh, perfect. I'd love to have you on again. It's been a great show so far. I've been talking to Jared Taylor, founder and editor of American Renaissance. You can visit them on the web at AmRen.com. Hope to see you all at the conference this weekend. Jared, do you have any other links you'd like to give out for our listeners to check out?
No, none that occur to me at this point. I think all of your listeners are probably familiar with all of the great sites that are furnishing such exciting information from our point of view. Our website is AmRen.com, and from there, the internet is at your fingertips.
Yep. Check out AmRen.com for more information. Jared, thank you once again for being on the program.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks so much.
And that was Jared Taylor, and that'll about do it for this episode of This Alt-Right Life. I'll be back next week, but until then, please be sure to check out righton.net for our latest articles. You can also check out my personal blog at mattforney.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to share it far and wide on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. If you're listening via SoundCloud, greatly appreciate it if you would like the podcast by hitting the heart icon on the player. You can also repost it to your accounts by hitting the repost button. You can also subscribe to the show by going to soundcloud.com/rightonradio. You can also, if you're listening to this via YouTube, please like it by hitting the thumbs up icon below the player. You can also subscribe to the show via Stitcher and the iTunes Store. And if you're listening via the iTunes Store, I'd greatly appreciate if you take the time to rate the podcast, and help it get into the ears of more people. Help spread the good gospel of the alternative right far and wide. This Alt-Right Life is presented by Chloe Love. Check her out on the web at chloelove.com, and the show also features music by Winglord. Illegitimate non carborundum, don't let the bastards grind you down. I'm Matt Forney. Thanks for listening, folks. I'm out.